There has not yet been a single Frenchman indicted before a French court of justice for the murder of an Algerian. In Indochina, in Madagascar, or in the other colonies, the native has always known that he need expect nothing from the other side. The settler's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. The native's work is to imagine all possible methods for destroying the settler. Those are words written by Franz Fanon.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafseli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. People always love to ask the question, what radicalized you? And of course, there's many answers to that question. But for me, I don't think any text has so profoundly and so immediately changed the way I think than when I read Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon for the first time as a first-year college student. I think before that point, I would have vaguely identified as a socialist, but I had not encountered Marx or anyone else in the leftist canon for that matter, and I wouldn't really seriously pick up Marx for another 8 or 9 years. But Fanon cut right to the core of how I see the world, probably because my major political reference points were the United States and Palestine. And while I've added a lot of texture to that worldview since, it hasn't really changed, and I still see national liberation as the principal political horizon of our time. But back then, and for a long time after, I didn't really think about the fact that Fanon was a psychiatrist. His being a doctor felt almost incidental to his role as a revolutionary. But of course, the two are inseparable.
Now, Fanon, despite his general associations with Algeria, was not born in Africa. He was born in the French Caribbean colony of Martinique. And when Martinique came under the control of the Nazi collaborationist regime of Vichy France, he fled the island and joined up with the Allies to fight against the evil empire that had taken over. He joined the Free French Forces, was sent to Morocco, then to Algeria, where he encountered the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers who were in Algeria. Went back to France after that war, studied to become a psychiatrist, after which he writes Black Skin, White Masks, which deals with the psychological impact of racism and colonialism. Afterward, he would move to Algeria and practice psychiatry at Blida. And following all of this, he would go on to join the FLN.
I think what's so fascinating about Fanon and his legacy is that there seems to be a kind of double erasure at play. Within the field of psychoanalysis, he's largely marginalized. And when he's upheld as a political philosopher and as a revolutionary, his medical practice is sidelined. But as we unpack in this episode, psychoanalysis and revolution have a lot to offer each other, which is not to suggest that the field of psychoanalysis is inherently, or in its current form, wholly revolutionary. It is most certainly not. But as the work of Fanon and other writers, including Walid Daqqa, make clear, the mind is a terrain where political struggle is constantly taking place.
I think I have more of a general interest in psychoanalysis as a concept than you, Dylan, which I should probably differentiate from psychotherapy for listeners, which I think most people are more familiar with. So in psychoanalysis, there is much more of an emphasis on interiority and discovery coming from within the self. So in regular psychotherapy, a therapist might speak very often, attempting to give new perspectives, new ways of thinking about situations. But in psychoanalysis, the analyst speaks very briefly and very little, oftentimes never giving advice of any kind. Simply, they are meant to aid in your own ability to discover the answers within yourself and to try to move you away from worrying about the quote-unquote other, capital letter O. And as a result, it has similar problems that psychotherapy might have when dealing with physical, material issues out there in the real world that do not only have to deal with internalized reactions to things. And in terms of its revolutionary potential or anti-imperialism, I mean, Freud talks about in Civilization and its discontents about societal changes that may need to happen. He wrote about religion and the ill effects it had on society. Wilhelm Reich, who we talk about very, very briefly in this episode, is somebody who wrote extensively about sexual repression in society and how that is one of the fundamental building blocks of fascism. But both of these psychoanalytic thinkers are not people who dealt with Marxism in a very serious way. Freud especially was vehemently anti-communist. And the idea that psychoanalysis could be utilized in a sort of way for socialism, for communism, for Marxism, let alone revolution, I think is a very novel concept, which is why the guest we had on for this discussion, I think, brings a very interesting perspective.
Absolutely. And you're totally right, Seamus, that I am less well read in psychoanalysis. In fact, I have barely read any major psychoanalytic works. And I think that that has been to my detriment as a thinker. And I think my tendency, is not a strictly Marxist orientation, but I do tend to think about things in terms of rationality and objective interests. And I think as the past several years have demonstrated that there is a lot of irrationality at play, irrationality, decision-making that cannot properly be deduced by objective conditions, objective interests, and really delving into the mind and the logic of the mind, I think is essential for understanding our world today. So I was very excited that we got to speak today with Dr. Lara Sheehi. Dr. Sheehi is a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She is a licensed clinical psychologist. She is the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast and is a very excellent scholar. She is the author of 2 books, the first of which is co-authored with her partner, Stephen Sheehi. It is titled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. And her second and newest book is titled From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. We are speaking today with Dr. Lara Sheehi. Dr. Sheehi is a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, a licensed clinical psychologist, and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. Lara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
I think it would probably be good if we started with some grounding in psychoanalysis as an area of study and practice. We spent a lot of time on this show covering the broader social forces that shaped our past and continue to shape our present. Military forces, economic forces, political forces. I think we generally think of these forces as acting on the level of the collective, shaping the decisions of state and non-state actors, social movements, national and subnational populations. But they also impact and intrude upon the individual psyches of those who come into contact with them. And I think there's maybe a kind of reflexive aversion to thinking about that too much. Maybe the impulse is that psychoanalysis maybe reduces what are properly conceived of as collective problems into individual problems. And then, of course, there's also the race and class element of it. I think maybe it's more natural to imagine the oppressor as sitting on the analyst's couch as opposed to the oppressed. But what I love about your work is that it problematizes all of that. And so I was hoping that maybe you could just tell us a bit about what psychoanalysis is, how you came to it as a field of study, and what you think it can offer to anti-colonial or otherwise liberatory struggles.
Thank you. What an opening. All right. This is a small question for me to take up. Well, let me start just with psychoanalysis as we know it, because I think what the setup or the sort of cynicism that people might have, particularly oppressed people of the world, towards psychoanalysis is a founded one. And I always start there. And I start there because psychoanalysis has always been involved in the work of power, in the work of state building, in the work of psyops, in the work of counterinsurgency. And as an ideology, framework, method, practice has been maybe the most quintessential, project of modernity. So all those sort of, in the book, I call it like, what the fuck, like why psychoanalysis? And people are right. I'll place that in the current time. There is a group of psychoanalysts who are actively engaging and providing consultation to the IOF on how to do genocide better. Every anti-trans bill that we are seeing being passed in the context of the settler colony of the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK, there are psychoanalysts that are consulting around that. I joke that every, overthrow of a leftist movement, particularly in Latin America, had a psychoanalyst behind it. So I always want to front that. That is psychoanalysis in its hegemonic form. And then there's this other piece that you're saying is like, my work troubles that. And I think my work troubles that precisely because I start with contending with the violence that any hegemonic practice, particularly in institutionalized form, and one that has always worked with the state, naturally, that's the logical extension of that. But then there's the psychoanalysis of Franz Fanon, who, in Black Skin, White Mask, in like the 4th page says, I'm a Marxist first, I'm a psychoanalyst second. And I think that is also the story of psychoanalysis, which is why I always say, I push upon psychoanalysts who don't like this at all. And I say psychoanalysis begins with Fanon, because I think there's something to be said about a psychoanalysis that is primed for revolutionary struggle. One of many tools towards revolution, one of many tools that we have to use, if for nothing else, because as a theory, it takes up issues of desire, of contradictions, of identifications. These are all the things that we think about when we talk about capitalism, for example, or when we talk about imperialism, or when we talk about class issues, about why folks forego, let's say, their class interests and side with their race instead, right? These are all questions that as a theory, psychoanalysis, in the hands of somebody like Franz Fanon, who's a Black revolutionary, right, and militant, or in the hands of people who were the ones who studied and thought about and wrote about liberation psychology in Latin America, these folks understood the contradictions that any project that takes up psychology might have, potentially because it can be captured and sort of integrated into an individualist bourgeois practice. But I don't think that's the only story. And I think that's the piece that's very important for me. One of the things I always say to people is I am not a proselytizer for psychoanalysis. I actually don't care if it disappears forever. It has done so much harm to people. But what I will say is that There are folks who have benefited from psychoanalysis. There are folks who feel like the theory speaks to them and their interiority with an expansiveness. And I'm interested in what it means when we can marshal the power of that type of psychoanalysis, of the psychoanalysis that doesn't have to choose between the individual and the collective, or the sociopolitical and the individual. A psychoanalysis that is heavily steeped in Marxist theory, in an anti-capitalist theory, and in a knowledge that understanding our psyche, understanding the imprints of the world, understanding that there are very conscious processes, and then the way that ideology works is also planting itself inside of us in ways where we don't even detect that it's there. That's the unconscious imprint of it as well. There are folks who are interested in that project too. And so for me, I'm just like, is there a way to seize this? Is there a way to seize the means of doing psychoanalysis and despecialize it so that, if nothing else, our struggles are better equipped to understand the onslaught and the ways that you were saying in the lead up that our interiority is implicated in the work of violence? That's the psychoanalysis that I'm pushing, that many of us sort of are interested in. That is not the hegemonic practice of psychoanalysis.
You brought up psyops a little bit before, and how psychoanalysts in particular, are oftentimes active in these kinds of governmental practices. When the phrases COINTELPRO or MK Ultra get brought up, I think the common inclination of a lot of people is to groan and to shrug and to get worried about conspiracy theories that are about to follow the invocation of these phrases. But these were actual, veritable government programs that you talk about in your book that the United States engaged in decades ago against various targets. Can you be more specific, more detailed about what these kinds of programs were? Who were they targeted against? And why did the US government and other governments like it prioritize the targeting of the psychological fabric of people? What prompted them to realize the importance of such a thing?
Yeah, it's so important because I think it puts us in a historical framework. And what I'll say is it started then, right, in the wake of the United States realizing that two other states were beating them in this part of the arm of the state. We think about arms of the state in general, but I think, to your point, the reason why there's a groan and a sort of eye roll and a worry about conspiracy theories when it comes to these programs is also part of the psyops. It is meant to make it look like it is fringe, that anybody who's worried about the United States particularly, but in general, any governments being involved in the work of manipulating and sort of intruding upon our psyches, you are meant to look like you are the one who is exaggerating, or you are the one that's quote unquote crazy, right? And that's how psyops and counterinsurgency can hide in plain sight, because nobody wants to be the person being like, I have a chip inside my head. I mean, nowadays with everything we see with AI and these guys and how clearly they talk about wanting to do this shit, it's not a surprise. But I think the lead up to this is that folks generally have been disciplined away from understanding or thinking about a government that is also functioning on that level. Now, what we start to see is in the 1950s, psyops has always been a part of power. We understand how colonialism, and I just talked about Franz Fanon. This is the centerpiece of his work. He talks about the ways that colonizers work on the oppressed psyche. The point is to steal the psyche. I'm paraphrasing here, but he says it's not enough just to reach into your present. The colonizer tries to reach into your past and also scramble your future, because it makes you think that there are no other possibilities other than what the colonizer is giving you, right? And we can extend that to any example. But in the 1950s, governments started to go, wait a second, we can't just have this be like a one-off or like this is just part of colonialism. We need to actually concretize this into an actual arm of the state that coheres with a lot of funding behind it, because two states were ahead of the United States, the UK and the state now known as Israel, the Zionist state. Both of them had psyops, arms of the state already. And the United States quickly realized we need to catch up. Now, like all things US empire, it very quickly became the most vicious psyops leader in the world. But to your point about like, why did they think this was important? I think it's, during the Iraq War and all this sort of thing, you can hear Petraeus saying stuff like hearts and minds, right? But this shit had a long history. And that's why I was interested in this book. The book doesn't give a comprehensive overview of PSYOPs by any means. I was more interested in mapping out how psychoanalysis has always been sort of arm in arm with state building processes and with the practice of power, precisely because psychoanalysis tells the outward story that it is a neutral process, that politics has nothing to do with it. And what I always say is that, psychoanalysis was already despecialized. It was just despecialized to support the state. Now our job is to sort of despecialize it for revolution. People recognized, there's something pliable here. The psyche is actually pliable. And this goes back all the way to Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, in the 1920s. And he writes the sort of most famous book just called Propaganda. Like the guy doesn't even need to cut corners. He's just like, I don't need to say anything more than this. This is just propaganda. And he uses his uncle's theory and specifically says that part of the way he gained legitimacy was through utilizing and mobilizing the Freudian name and the Freudian legacy and saying, hey, I have something I have to offer here. I understand the way that people's psyche works. I understand what he called the primal horde, how people think in groups. I understand the way that people's fears can be manipulated. And he did it towards consumption and marketing, but very quickly started to think about how do we support the overthrow of leftist, particularly communist programs in, like I said, Latin American countries. He's most implicated in the overthrow in Guatemala, of course, right? And this is why a lot of countries started to use PSYOPs, because there was a tried and tested, quote unquote, field that this was being tried in. And we can sort of fast forward and look at Gaza, right now, and think about the ways in which weapons companies are actually trying out things. And when they are field tested, they become legitimate. Psychoanalysis was doing a version of this with these propaganda wars and kind of gained a legitimacy in this. Fast forward, we start to see, of course, in Guantanamo Bay with enhanced interrogation techniques, aka torture. So there's this long history of people understanding that, yes, you can bomb the shit out of people, and that is going to cause a lot of harm. That's just going to cause bodily harm, and it's going to cause immense suffering. And sometimes that's enough. But what does it mean to actually spread empire? And if empire is an expansionist project like Zionism, it cannot be complete without the theft of the internal world and the psyche as well. They needed people to actually change from the interior and become rewired to internalize imperialism wholesale. Right? And that's why I think the psyche became so central. Now, one of the things of MK Ultra, particularly MK Ultra, is also being tested on incarcerated people. So this is a whole, or Sammy Burton talks about this in terms of the Long Attica Revolt, about how incarcerated people, particularly in the context of the United States, were also a population, because they were captured and had no rights, could be tested on. And that is what MK Ultra is, which is another reason why I say we start with Fanon, because it also is the story of a European invention that effectively was used by exploiting, extracting, and dominating Black and brown bodies and people of the global South to steal information about their interiority to understand how to control people better, right? And I think we just need to say that outright to know the history and the truth of how the entire field is implicated in this.
I think it's so fascinating that these developments in theory around the psyche and its uses all kind of happen around the same time. Like, just as you were speaking about this, I was thinking about, okay, so these like insights into the mind as a terrain of contestation or struggle are shaping consumerism and advertising. They're shaping government state aggression in terms of how to prosecute wars and how to wage wars. Although I think you're right to kind of make fun of Petraeus here, because you see the United States kind of rediscovering the logic of counterinsurgency every generation. They kind of stumble back into it, and sometimes they refer to it as that and sometimes they don't.
I just have to interrupt Dylan here.
Yeah,
once we do it, I think in a non-woke way.
Yeah, right.
I think this will be a permanent lesson, but that's fine.
We'll win all our wars from here on out. But the thing that actually jumped out to me that a connection I hadn't really ever made is that same logic is also happening in the level of the law. So in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education is the first time ever that the Supreme Court acknowledges that a psychic harm can be real. And that is like how they strike down Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is to say like, actually psychic harms are real harms, which is this really novel intervention in the jurisprudence. But it's just kind of blowing my mind that those developments are happening both in a kind of quote unquote progressive way in the law, also in a commercial way, and then also in a kind of like state empire way.
Yeah. It's also how capture happens, right? Because fast forward to today's world when we can see DEI efforts, it's all about harm and psychic harm and emotional harm and the way that it gets captured. But the point also is that it displaces the actual state project, that this is a long-term state project, the point of which is to shore up and stabilize empire and the ravaging of the entire world in the name of US empire and expansionism. Because then it just becomes, oh, it's an individual problem, or worse, this is like help. This is just saviorism. I mean, it's a helping field. And I think that is part of the counterinsurgency through these sort of mechanisms. And that's why people think it's a fringe thing to talk about MK Ultra, or that this is of the past. And I think that's the piece that I want to dispel, is like these long-term projects and the way that power works and intrudes on minds, psyche, soul, everything else, and the way people think about themselves and others cannot be a singular project. It is a long-term, pernicious, directed, targeted project that has to go hand in hand with all the others, like you're saying, and also what's the making of a citizen and the subject and individuality and all the rest of the evils that we're fighting against.
Totally. I actually want to go back to Fanon. You've mentioned Fanon a couple of times now, and you mentioned that you root psychoanalysis as being founded by Fanon in a certain type of way. And I actually had the opportunity to go to Algiers early last year, and contra Adam Schatz, who wrote a biography of Fanon where he like weirdly claimed that Algeria had forgotten about him. He was everywhere. Fanon, street names, images, etc. And clearly his legacy as a revolutionary is on very firm ground. And when my friends and I went actually out to Blida to go visit the psychiatric hospital where he was the director in the 50s, the doctor who toured us around spoke with great pride about Fanon's techniques that he pioneered there in terms of like unlocking all of the patient's doors and letting people commingle, etc. But when we asked if any of those practices endured through the present, he was just like, oh no, we don't do any of that anymore. So clearly Fanon's theoretical work looms quite large, and his influence runs throughout both of your books. But I'm wondering like how you assess his impact on the actual practice of psychoanalysis and whether he has been kind of erased from the profession on a practical or professional level. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, he has been. I love that you started there. And I love that you started there because Adam Schatz is shameful in terms of how he mobilizes it. And he's part of the machinery, this counterinsurgent machinery that would have us sort of neutralize and defang who Fanon is. It's also part of the white imaginary. And I want to say that it's a racist imaginary that constantly, when Fanon is talked about, especially in the clinical field, Fanon is not taught in any psychoanalytic institute in any meaningful way. He might show up here and there, and that's usually at the behest of an individual instructor, usually a person of color who wants to teach Fanon, right? But in a structured way, he's nowhere to be seen. And I think the expulsion of Fanon from the clinical canon into, let's say, post-colonial studies or Black studies, where he belongs, by the way. I'm not saying he doesn't, but there's something to be said about him never being taught or thought about as a clinician. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing. But the other side of it is now when you see some people try to teach Fanon, they always talk about it as like a renaissance of Fanon. And I always roll my eyes for the reasons you're saying. I'm like, none of you have been in the global South. None of you understand that Fanon didn't go anywhere for people who are actually interested in anti-colonial process and thinking through. Now, the effect of him not showing up and his practices not showing up in clinical space is, I think, indicative of the imperial reach of a Eurocentric psychology, one that forgets that he actually was a clinician, has so much to teach us about it. Now, the other thing is that it was only in 2019 that we actually got his clinical papers translated. They were available in French, but in 2019, you get this Alienation and Freedom that's like thousands of pages long, and you get all his meticulous clinical papers where he breaks down these experiments he was going through. I have a chapter coming out soon in a handbook about Fanon that sort of imagines him as already was kind of an abolitionist register before we really thought about it in that way, because he was thinking about all the ways in which we had to eliminate all incarcerative, these are his words, conditions to be able to alleviate psychic suffering. And so us seeing now that that has not continued might not be surprising when we think about big pharma, when we think about the ways that hospitals are privatized, that there's a push towards privatization in the global south, even if it's not, even if there are public hospitals, there's a push towards that. The over-medication of the world writ large, those are the forces that I think then asphyxiate or strangulate his actual clinical processes from coming through. Because when you read his clinical work, it's not only meticulous, but it also prioritizes long-term collaborative process that includes everybody, not just the so-called patient, but the entire culture, people's families. So he ended up in Tunis, and he basically started, before he was transported to the United States and then ended up dying here, he started what we now know as a day hospital, where patients basically could choose when they wanted to leave and come in and out as they please. And their entire family was involved in setting up their treatment program. Like, these are the things nobody really knows or talks about Fanon. But the writing out of that is not accidental. And I think that is what I continuously come back to, that any impact that Fanon has had in the clinical world, and there has been many throughout the world, has been unceremoniously erased and displaced out of Eurocentric psychology, which is the story of racism and colonialism and displacement of what I would call a psychic grammar that is from the global south. We don't need to invent anything. He was writing in the 1950s. And then we have folks now talking about, having to quantify how racism actually affects people. And I'm like, Franz Fanon was talking about this in the 1950s. So this rediscovery over and over again, I think, is also indicative of a particular white supremacy and racism that just cannot hold on and keep a hold of an archive of knowledge that pre-exists anything that we're seeing today in terms of the vernacular of the field around these issues.
I think people are very familiar with Freud, with Jung, maybe Wilhelm Reich, though that may speak to certain circles that I'm in. But when I was living in Lebanon, I would encounter psychoanalysts who were exclusively working within the European tradition, with Lacan in particular. That seemed to be uniformly dominant. I mean, when you're in the United States, you may work with analysts who are pulling from maybe Erich Fromm, but I essentially never hear, and I really do mean that, I basically never hear about, especially not Fanon, but any sort of global south psychoanalytic thinkers, Arab psychoanalytic thinkers entering this kind of discussion. Is there an equivalent tradition of Arab psychoanalytic thinking that is not being referenced by people in perhaps the way it should be? And if there isn't, then do you have any idea as to why that is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my partner, Stephen, and I wrote a book called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which does a little bit of this historicizing of it. And, the shorthand answer is they're not called upon because those of us who are working in this way don't have a school of thought, a unified school of thought, which people can sort of then wholesale identify with, like Lacanians, which is funny because Lacanians' whole thing are not to be a school of thought or an institute, but then they end up having coherent around, the personality of Lacan, which is not surprising in the context of Lebanon, that the Francophone world is what dominates, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of a colonial import and a sort of identification with what that means to be a Lacanian and to be a French-speaking Lacanian, because all of us know there also are non-French-speaking Lacanians who love themselves a lot. So that's my shade for today.
We could go on for a while about
Lacan. We could go on forever about exactly. Yeah. However, I think one of the ways is that because it's not hierarchized or, let's say, concretized in an institute or a school of thought that then reproduces those thinkers, that's why I think we don't see that. But there is a long history of not only people practicing psychoanalysis in Palestine, in Lebanon, all across the Arab world, but also the concepts that psychoanalysis takes up. So in our book, we talk about, for example, the idea of a nafs. The idea of nafs in Arabic and particularly in Muslim thought is psyche, self, breath, soul. These are debates that have been ongoing for centuries before psychoanalysis emerges as a European invention. So I think there's something also about misattuning away from certain modes of knowledge production that are psychoanalytic in nature, right? And then saying, oh, here's the point in time in which Freud coheres this into a theory. And the purview of psychoanalysis then only becomes everything that came after Freud. And then over top of that, only in a very specific way. We have the same conversation, by the way, in a class issue in a sort of urban versus rural in the context of the United States. Because there's always the question of what constitutes psychoanalysis? These are actual debates, by the way, in the field. What constitutes psychoanalysis? What is really psychoanalysis? What is not psychoanalysis? For me, the interesting question there is who determines those parameters? We know that story. It's the story of power. And those are the people who get to say, this is psychoanalysis, this is not psychoanalysis. So I think if there are people not being cited, it's because institutes look at us and say, and I have had people say this to me directly, this is not psychoanalysis. They will actually say, no matter how much you know the theory inside out, and mobilize psychoanalytic theory and use it towards the ends that people who love it want to, their response to you is, this is not psychoanalysis, this is a political agenda.
But I hate to talk about Lacan again, but so much of this stuff is talking about French puns and talking about the nom du père and how it relates to it sounds like this other French word. And it's how could you possibly argue that something could not be psychoanalysis if this is the kind of stuff that influences thousands upon thousands of thinkers around? It baffles my mind.
It wasn't made in the psychoanalysis region of France. That's why.
Exactly. And because you're fundamentally racists. This is racism 101, right?
Yeah.
It's one person can, then the other person doesn't, and this is not psychoanalysis. That's partially tongue-in-cheek and it's partially not, because unfortunately I was actually brought up in this field and they are full of racists and Eurocentric white supremacist racists. But there's also an issue of legitimacy and of stabilizing the political project of what psychoanalysis is. Psychoanalysis is in its hegemonic form, in the ways you are describing, is a psychoanalysis that is interested in creating atomized subjects, not subjects who can engage in the world politically, and there is no separation between the clinic and the street. It is a psychoanalysis of an individual who sits and self-reflects and is primarily alienated from the rest of the world. So in some ways, they're right. That is not, I've said that to a senior analyst. I'm like, when she was like, this is not my psychoanalysis, I'm like, you're fucking right. It's not your psychoanalysis. I'm not interested in that psychoanalysis.
I wanted to get into a little bit more detail about racism and bigotry within this field, because there was a really fascinating book that I read last year called The Struggle Against Mourning by the Israeli psychoanalyst Ilani Kogan, who's from Romania, had settled in occupied Palestine as a child in the late 50s, some 10 years after the Nakba. The case studies in the book are about mourning, about going through that process, and she works a lot with exile and with the Holocaust. And some of these case studies were conducted at the time of the Second Intifada. And the subject of bombings by Palestinians inside Israel's borders come up in the latter chapters. And despite all of this complexity, all of this deep and complicated analysis that she gives throughout the book, when the subject of Palestinians come up, you can feel the entire thing just flatten out. As suddenly all of the context goes out the window, it becomes about anti-Semitism in general, this general feeling of the Holocaust being back, and Palestinians exclusively come to be analyzed as symbols for other Israelis to take in, as underdogs or as sexual threats. And you talk in this book about Israeli psychoanalysts, about Zionist psychoanalysts more generally, trying to force their way into psychoanalytic discussions to destroy any kind of discussion of Palestinians as individuals, as people who are relevant to the field. Why is this such a noticeable phenomenon?
Yeah, great question. I think the most simple, immediate answer I'll give, and then I'll get more into the nuts and bolts of it, is that the practice of psychoanalysis is a practice of ideology, but it pretends that it's not. So when it's confronted with its ideological ends, like this is a prime example, this book you're talking about is a prime example of somebody leaning into theory, probably like high theory, and just going there and really representing themselves as super thoughtful. And they might be. I'm not, casting shade on people's fucking clinical work. Maybe they're great analysts. But it's always remarkable the collapse of psychic space that happens with the mere whisper of Palestine. I wrote a piece called Palestine is a 4-letter word for this reason, because over and over and over again, the mere mention of Palestine, you don't even have to say anything. You don't have to say settler colonialism. You don't have to say genocidal state. This is way pre-genocide. The mere mention of Palestine ushers in this ideological collapse, this psychic collapse in fullness. And people can no longer think. That, to me, if I'm following the actual theory, if I give a fuck about the theory that these people so dearly want to hold on to, I would be like, that's curious. There's something happening here. But to your point, they become behaviorists. And to me, that's telling. Like, here you have this breadth of psychoanalytic technique, but the moment that Palestine is mentioned, you somehow become a behaviorist, and Palestinians have no interiority and they're just behavioral beings that are like brutes. Or, like you said, symbolic, which also is an emptying out, of course, of their interiority and complexity and is a racist process in and of itself. But I think the crux of the matter is psychoanalytic practitioners, because they have spent so long pretending that their practice is actually neutral, have no stamina to handle when the actual world comes in. And many of them are actually themselves identified with the ideologies that come crashing in on them. So let me give you an example. Right after Tawafan al-Aqsa, the International Psychoanalytic Association puts out this call. The International Psychoanalytic Association is known for saying we don't take political positions. Never mind that they took a position about Ukraine. Of course they did. But they pretend that they're neutral. Right after Tawafan al-Aqsa, they put out this statement hastily that says, we are in full solidarity with our Israeli colleagues. And then they, wax poetic about things. And with our non-terrorist Palestinian colleagues. Yeah.
No,
I'm sorry. Whoa.
This is still up on their website.
Whoa. Okay.
That is crazy.
Do you have terrorist psychoanalytic colleagues? But you weren't.
I mean, a very Lacanian of you to do exactly a word precisely. I wish your listeners could see your faces, because this is precisely it, right? That, in a nutshell, for me, is the collapse in the moment where, like we are seeing with empire imploding on itself, where the contradictions can no longer hold. That is what Palestine is. And Tawafan al-Aqsa, of course, just ratchets it up. Meanwhile, like I'm saying, there are psychoanalysts who are consulting with the IOF. There are analysts who are involved in providing tattoos to IOF soldiers who've been quote unquote traumatized, or psychoanalysts, like I mentioned in the book, who are part of doing these picket line crossing conferences, imagining Palestinians without them being there. Like, you can't even make this shit up. And for me, there's no other way to explain it than to say you are fully identified with a particular ideology. And when anything actually disrupts that, this is to use psychoanalytic theory, there's an annihilation anxiety that actually takes hold. And people can no longer sustain the contradictions that they actually spend every single day disavowing. Right? Now, here's the final thing I'll say about this is where you see the most pernicious and violent weaponization of theory. Because any of us who come in and want to read it that way, that is when this is not psychoanalysis, or you are primitive, you're not mature enough, you split, and therefore you don't have a depressive position, right? They go to Klein. I mean, anything, then all of a sudden, they're all lives matter, caring about every single fucking theory. But any other time, they're like fighting with each other about which theory is correct, right? It's always about expelling dissidents, which is also the story of psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud expelled every dissident. You named them. You named almost all of them at the beginning. Wilhelm Reich, right? Like all of these people are people who have been kicked out because they were thought to be militants in the face of a sort of very orthodox practice. Yeah, there's so much there. There's so much there.
Yeah, I kind of want to push further on this idea of the denial of Palestinian interiority. You've kind of leveraged this term nafs as the Arabic word for self. And one thing that stood out for me from your work is your writing on Palestinian suicide, which I found to be really quite moving and compelling and kind of cause for me to think about the idea of suicide in new ways. You write about it both as an individual act, a kind of like final attempt to reclaim agency amidst the indignity of occupation. And in a way, I think I should say that, neither kind of valorizes suicide as a revolutionary act nor kind of demeans it as a form of cowardice, but really kind of digs into the act itself. In the epilogue of your book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, you and your partner also write about Palestinian suicide, not as an act of the oppressed, but also as a kind of collective demand that is made externally on the Palestinian nation. And you close your book with a discussion of a June 2019 opinion piece written by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, who is actually now, once again, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. I know. And I was really shocked to read this. I had not come across this op-ed before. He literally says that a national suicide on the part of the Palestinians is what is needed for peace. And of course, a super jarring formulation to read, but kind of in line with what we were just discussing, I don't even know if it's really that different from what many Zionists or even non-Zionists believe the Palestinians ought to do, which is to say the Palestinians, for better or worse, ought to give up their national cause and essentially suffocate slowly in the face of the reality of Israel's existence, right? The demand is always, you have to just accept the state of Israel, accept that the state of Israel means the state of occupation that you have to then live under. And that will continue until your national claims extinguish, which is necessarily a kind of national suicide. And the implication here, and of course it is a deeply racist and colonial implication, is that there is no content to the Palestinian self. And that any insistence otherwise really only exists as an affront to the occupier. I think you just mentioned it as like a fear of an annihilation. And yeah, to me, that really gets to the heart of Zionism as an ideological project. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about Zionism as the destruction of Palestinian selfhood and also of the denial of a Palestinian inner world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they're implicated in each other. Like there isn't one without the other. And I think this goes back to what we were discussing before about why is the psyche so important? Because that suicidal prescription cannot happen if you don't implant helplessness, despair, and have people actually believe that their entire future is already written for them, right? And so just give up. Like, why are you even doing this? Which, of course, evokes for me Ghassan Kanafani's conversation between the sword and the neck. And this is his point about being militant about this, is like, you actually mean capitulation. You might say it in these nice words. Danny Danon is a fucking fascist, and he will say it straight out. But there's at least an honesty to that, right? There's a naked honesty that actually belies the entire purpose of Zionism as an eliminationist project. It's a settler, colonial, eliminationist, expansionist project that is irreconcilable. The settler cannot exist if the indigenous exists, and vice versa, right? So I think implicating the interiority of people in that is also true. I think sometimes people couch it in terms of dehumanization. I actually don't think it has much to do with that, because ideologically speaking, you have to practice an ideology in its totality all the time. You don't half-ass ideology. You're like Zionism, you're fully committed to what that means. And what that means is that I own and sort of am allowed access to every single space here because I actually am in power, and I dictate and circumscribe every aspect of your life, which is why you see Zionists melt down when Palestinians actually refuse to die, when Palestinian prisoners refuse to break down, when you have Qassam brigades still fighting, when you have Hezbollah still fighting, when you have them take positions that actually dispel this fantasy that you can, just because you can in your mind. That's the colonial mindset 101, like just because I can, I will. And then you have actual indigenous presence, literal just presence, disrupting that. That's why you have to make pronouncements like, okay, if we, in some ways I see Danny Danon as being like, well, we haven't been able to accomplish this, so you guys need to do it yourself and just give up. But that there's a psy war happening. There's a psychological warfare that's happening there. It's sort of akin to what I hear about the AI bros kind of saying, like you might as well accept it because it's going to be here anyway. So you just do it because this is the future you have in front of you. So you might as well just give up and give into it now. There's the same logic that's there. And what it does is actually foreclose any other possibilities of being and life making. And I think that's the view also. It does come from a racist place, but it also comes from a place of a complete and total alignment with an ideology that is based on extraction, elimination, and dispossession. And so those pronouncements actually have no contradiction for a Zionist or for a settler in general, whether that's a settler in Turtle Island or a settler in Palestine, right? There's like a common sense aspect to it. And sometimes they look at you and they're like, I don't understand. We heard a similar thing of Trump about Iran, right? Where he was just like, I don't understand why they're just not surrendering. There's an honesty to that inability to reckon with the fact that people actually have incredibly sophisticated internal worlds that have been engaged in these questions before your arrival, settler, right? And actually part of that engagement is a way that people continue to forge life. And that is psychically affirming and psychically sustaining. That's why in the book with Steve, you're talking about our first book, The Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, where we take up this question of suicide. And I think people struggle with that a lot. What's interesting is people in my field struggle with that a lot because we are taught to think about suicide only through a liability perspective, where people get very afraid rather than actually as a part, life and death exist as a part of everyday life, and people have ways of thinking through that and negotiating. And when you live in a condition, like you're saying, of oppressor attempting to control every aspect of your life, including the way you die, how you die, and in the case of Walid Daqa, that your body is still in a fridge in IOF custody. So even your release of your dead body, it's not enough to just kill people. Nadir Sharhoub Kabrakian talks about the overkill, right? So in response to that, a refusal to accept the premise that you, as my oppressor, can actually control everything, including death, not just life, is an act of actual truth-telling and a tethering to material reality. You actually don't get to choose how this happens. We have a say in this too, versus the prescription that Danny Danon is saying, right? But PSYOPs is very much about making people's interior stamina to continue being connected to the possibilities that exist. That is the fabric that it goes after, possibilities.
What you're talking about with this confusion at refusing to die, it reminds me of, I think 2 years ago, back in 2024, there was this gigantic Israeli media firestorm about these images coming out of Palestinians in Gaza enjoying themselves, quote unquote, enjoying themselves at the beach under immense suffering, trying to make something out of the dire circumstances they were in. And they had pundits just debating with each other about what needs to be done in order to make these people feel subdued. Like in the English language media, all of these defenders of Israel talk about how, like, if they just laid down their arms, in Danon's case, like, national liberation could be achieved if you simply all committed national suicide. Like, no, what they mean is on an individual basis, they want you to be killed en masse. They want you to have no functioning of any kind whatsoever. There is nothing that you can do to assuage their concerns about you. They hate you wholly, completely.
And I'll just add that there is a real profound irony that the Israelis failed to grasp this, given their self-styled role as the inheritors of the legacy of the Holocaust, when to me, the example of reclaiming sovereignty over life and death that is the most powerful from the historical record is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of Jews who had been forced into concentration camps, watched as their family members were taken away to slaughter, knowing full well that they were in no position to militarily overthrow their captors, choosing to die with dignity by rising up and fighting back. Kind of a quintessential portrait of reclaiming that sovereignty over personhood, and denying the power over life and death to their oppressors. That image has somehow been lost, or repressed, or whatever it is. I think is just really striking. And another kind of thing I wanted to bring into this conversation is that, we talk about the agency of Palestinian resistance, be it the act of going to the beach or be it the act of rising up, and the actions of the Qassam brigades and other militants, etc. It certainly troubles the idea of the Palestinian in the mind of the occupier, the willingness to resist and the refusal to capitulate. But it also troubles the idea of the Palestinian in the mind of the humanitarian. And I think this is something that you take up as well, which is to say the limits of the humanitarian approach to solidarity with Palestinians, which maybe recognizes Palestinian humanity, but treats the Palestinian as a categorical victim. And this maybe correctly identifies Palestinians as suffering physical and psychic harm, but insofar as it fails to actually grasp the socio-political structure of that harm, to grasp the fact that Zionism means occupations, means dispossession, it can't actually offer a treatment, right? Because what would it even mean to treat, for example, the PTSD of Palestinians in Gaza when that bombardment is ongoing? It's been ongoing since October 2023. It's been ongoing for years. I think about these Qassam fighters, right? They're all youth, right? They're, for the most part, these are all, young men who have experienced Israeli bombardment throughout their entire life, right? From the moment that they're born, essentially, all Palestinians in Gaza have an experience with this form of violence, and just a very idea of thinking of a Palestinian as a victim in search of a treatment for those psychic harms, it's impossible, really. It's impossible. I wonder if you can just speak a little bit to how the humanitarian approach, maybe in contrast with the kind of colonialist approach, but maybe in parallel, really renders the defiant Palestinian as just completely unintelligible.
Yes, absolutely. It's a different form of capture, right? It's a different form of capture that demands a particular type of legibility out of the oppressed, who in the end need to be grateful for the magnanimity of an international community that is coming to their aid, right? And I mean that very specifically because I think it does emerge from colonial processes and racist processes, but it also is fundamentally a way to depoliticize and defang revolutionary movements that have their own indigenous forms of claiming and fighting not only for liberation, but of sovereignty and self-determination. This is, I think, what we're seeing from the ground, whether it's in Lebanon or in Yemen or Iran or Palestine, is we're seeing people say, actually, we're no longer playing this game of the failures of humanitarian stuff. We understand that as an actual system that was rigged from the start and meant to capture us in different ways. Because one of the things that I learned very early on, particularly in mental health, when you think about the ways in which the humanitarian sector and the way it doles out mental health issues or mental health services, is that there is a very specific and direct dictate about the trade-off that happens. You are not to, for example, refugees, you can't call yourself a refugee. You can't, in most of these cases, even say Palestinian as a trade-off for the actual aid that you're going to get. 100% of the aid in the so-called West Bank for mental health services are through external humanitarian aid, or NGOs or anything like that. one of the things that they require is anybody taking their funding has to sign paperwork that says, I don't support terrorism, which means anybody who's fighting for self-determination then has to be reported or you lose your funding. So there's like already an inbuilt constitutive expectation that does the same version that Danny Dannon's piece says, is for you to get help, you must give up your claims to sovereignty in a particular way. The only way I will see you and treat you is if you present and are legible in a very specific way. And what that usually means is you have to come here and bleed in front of me and prove to me that you have actually been victimized. So no smiling for you, no going to the beach for you, no celebrating the release of your incarcerated loved ones, which is part of the farce, right? This is very early on. I would say to people like, this idea of a correct affect is actually a lie because no affect is allowed. You're not allowed to have joy. I think there was an actual piece that was like, no joy allowed, right? Like the Israelis were like, you're not allowed to celebrate. You're not allowed. And they actually wrote that. They said, no joy is allowed, which is such a confessional around these things. And then these humanitarian aid organizations pretzel themselves into the same formations. One of the examples that Stephen and I wrote about in the book is Save the Children, that had this sort of, this is the other piece. They also import these manualized treatments that have no sort of bearing on the actual space itself, and in fact actually work against indigenously produced and communally produced processes to absorb the political nature of the oppression. This is the important thing. So this Save the Children study was done in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, and it was working with kids whose homes had been demolished. We know who's doing the demolishing of the homes. This isn't just some like meteor that fell in Al-Quds and specifically in Al-Quds and nowhere else. There's a project of demolishing homes in Al-Quds specifically, in the Judaization of Al-Quds. What happened was, instead of the spaces that these kids already had to process this trauma, like you're saying, in the context of a family in which the oppressor is named, what happened is they took these kids out and did one-on-one therapy in a manualized way. And what ended up happening after a year is the person who's in charge of it, who's Palestinian, saw that the kids were actually showing more symptoms of trauma, what we typically call PTSD, than before. And that's because they individualized the children and allowed them to talk and process about their trauma without naming who their traumatizer was. So then it became, oh my gosh, this is happening to me, with no explanation that this is happening to me because I'm Palestinian and because my land is occupied by a genocidal apartheid state that needs to demolish homes to create more Jewish space and more theft of land. They already had words for that. They already had ways to process that. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't an impact. We know the impact and the viciousness of occupation and settler colonialism, but it is experienced and talked about and processed in a nomenclature that is close to home and politicized versus this sort of alien, decontextualized, Eurocentric model that, like you're saying, is also like time-stamped. Where's the post in this, right?
I felt my blood pressure go up so many times during that answer. I was just bewildered. I just wanted to interject. There was a Palestinian psychotherapist, Dr. Mustafa al-Masri, who unfortunately passed away last year after he finally managed to leave the Strip for Egypt. And there was something that he said in August 2024 that I think about a lot, because he was working at this time with kids who had been displaced, their families had been killed, and he was talking about the difficulties of that. And at one point, he just posted this: I wanted to shout, "Wake up, world." Then I realized that the whole world is awake and watching. Many profanities ran through my mind, but I spit on the ground and keep moving alone. No, there's no... How do you talk about these things without actually referencing the situation at hand?
You're unethical. There's no other way around. You're unethical. And people get very angry with me when I say that. But it's like, there is no other explanation. You are right. You are an unethical clinician. And I have no problem saying that to anybody. And I say it to their faces. You are unethical. if you are not taking these issues up, because you're not taking in or attributing or recognizing the forces that create psychic suffering. Therefore, how could you be attendant to alleviating that?
Yeah. So I want to talk about one of those forces, or maybe a structure for one of those forces. And it's a concept that recurs in your work, especially in your newest book, and that is psychic intrusion. I'll let you explain in more detail what it means. But as I understand it, you are following Fanon, who we've spoken extensively about, and Walid Daqqa, who has come up in this conversation once, but we've really, multiple times on this show, we've engaged with his writing. But both of them locate the mind as a primary site of colonial violence. Fanon, in the first part of Wretched of the Earth, writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the police and the prison guards are who bring the occupation not only into the home, but also into the mind of the native. And Walid Daqqa wrote about searing consciousness, how prison guards and the prison structure more broadly seek to dominate the psyche of the imprisoned Palestinian and reconfigure his or her internal world. Can you talk a bit about psychic intrusion as a colonial strategy or technology and what the tools available are to resist it?
Yes, of course. I think there's a reason why I use Fanon and Daqqa and most political prisoners, because they are very well aware of the ways in which the psyche is implicated. And I think by and large, what I was really interested in is tracking the ways in which our psyche is purposefully targeted. Oftentimes we think about, oppression or systems of oppression work on us, and then we become symptomatic after the fact, that something happens, like capitalism happens, and then we're symptomatic. And what I'm sort of trying to bring us to is that it's not an after effect, it's an actual target. The intrusion into our psyche is purposeful, it's calculated, and in the words of psychological operations warriors, as they call themselves, it's unmysterious. They do it on purpose. I call it intrusion because I want us to be alert to the political project that's behind it. And so for shorthand, it's any of the ways that these structures of power and systems that saturate our life intrude upon our interior world with the intent to actually settle inside of us, reconfigure our internal world, and become think about the material topography of our external life. It reconfigures our insides. So if we think the parallel to Palestine, where checkpoints become just a normative fixture of everyday life, and you have to kind of remind people hey, this is not what Palestine looks like. This is an overlay. Psychic intrusions do the same thing in our interior world, right? And so they are sort of ideological condensations, they're givens, but really the important thing that I was tracking was that they are fundamentally meant to disrupt our ability to remain tethered to material reality. And with that, they are meant to derail our ability to organize and to imagine, this is to your Fanon quote, to imagine that a different world is possible. It keeps us locked into foreclosures, right? So the way that I came upon this was definitely after Telefon al-Aqsa. Over and over and over again, I would hear people say, both quote unquote on the couch and comrades and friends would tell me, I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm becoming undone and I'm the one that's crazy. And at the same time, they would detail to me in excruciating detail everything that was actually happening. So there was no actual symptomatic proof, quote unquote, to the craziness they felt, but they still felt crazy. So I started to think there's something else happening here that induces that feeling and actually has an effect of derailing us. Because then we're talking about, am I actually crazy? Am I really seeing what I'm seeing? Rather than being able to militantly track exactly what power was doing. And here's where I sort of look at Fanon's idea of the psychoaffective, which he brings up in Wretched of the Earth, and I extend it and I say, we need to think about this as a psychopolitical affective terrain, because the politics, the political economy of this, the political economy of psychic intrusions is actually central to us understanding what the political project is. It's to make certain that we remain individuals, that we feel helpless, that our despair is commodified, that we think that nothing is worth fighting for, that the world is just owned by those in power and there's nothing else we can do about it. That's fundamentally when we know an intrusion has taken hold. Affect states are the point of contact of intrusions. And what I sort of ask people to think about is like, what would it be for us to always consider that the psyche is contested space? And the psyche is contested space in as much as power will use your psyche. And it's actually in the moments where you're resisting and refusing that it's going to come down on you the hardest. Because that's what the architects of psychological warfare want. That's why they go after Walidaka. That's why they go after people like political prisoners who have a cause bigger than them. And they become prime targets to try and break because they want to disconnect them from that cause and from the ability to remain tethered to that. So what I sort of really want to remind people, particularly in this book, is if our psyche is contested space, there are also ways for us to track this, to know that power is always playing on our mind and in us. And it mobilizes affect in particular moments. Because I'm not saying that fear and exhaustion and confusion don't exist just naturally. What I'm saying is, can we be not just curious, but actually hypervigilant about the moments in which these affect states emerge in their most poignant forms? And can we then become suspicious about what might be happening and why our affect stopping us in our tracks might actually stabilize the work of power? It needs to conscript us, right? And this is why I talk about psychic militancy, to your point of like, what do we do against it? There is a way in which we use the concept of militancy, and we usually think about it in terms of armed struggle, and I'm all about that. We need to be thinking about it. And also, we need to understand that if the psyche is a space that gets targeted, that there are ways that we also can militantly arm our psyche against intrusion. At the very least, we can also just always be attendant to the fact that it's happening, because I believe in us remaining antagonistic towards it. Like, it's not a foregone conclusion. I'm not nihilist. I'm not a pessimistic leftist. I'm not nihilistic in how far power can reach. It will use everything in its reach and every lever of power to do what it intends. But from everything we're seeing, there's always resistance. So can we do that psychically too?
Doctor, thank you so much for speaking with us.
I wanted to make space if we've talked a lot about both of your books, but I want to make space for you to plug your show, which is really excellent, called Psychic Militancy. Can you tell us about it and where we can find it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for plugging it and for watching. We have a good time. Part of the reason why, it's called Psychic Militancy for a reason, because I'm obsessed with the ways that we can make our mind militant alongside other things. And really, it's a show that's meant to have these public-facing conversations across the board with folks. We do a lot of live streams that take up events that are happening, like right now, of course, what's happening in Lebanon, in Iran, in Palestine, but also talk to comrades whose work is to think through these things and think through these contradictions, and for them to actually talk about some of the struggles or the seductions that they also feel. So I'm really interested in these conversations not being fringe, not being behind closed doors, and on my part to despecialize any psychic knowledge that I can, so folks can be armed, psychically armed in the struggle. There's long form interviews, and then there are live streams, and you can find us on YouTube. And also we have a Patreon if you want exclusive content.
All right, Dr. Lara Sheehi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.